So guys, today I'm going to be talking about two articles that I found from outside online. And I guess ultimately what we're talking about today is structuring your workouts, but the first article is going to be pretty fascinating. Now look, I will concede that if you are not a runner, and perhaps even if you are a runner that just isn't into data, this first article might not be fascinating. But it's fascinating to me, and I'd wager it's fascinating to one or two of you too. Let's get into it. What's up my friends, this is also the weekly running and training vlog, where the main purpose of this video is for you to tell me about your week of running. I want to hear about your successes, and I definitely want to hear about those setbacks. So go ahead and drop a comment, let me know about how your week of running went. So this article that I was building up as being fascinating is about the Boston Marathon. And ultimately, it's about some stats that have been pulled in from Strava, so we can see what Boston Marathon qualifiers do that perhaps runners of other marathons don't do. I told you it was going to be fascinating, right? This is going to be pretty data heavy, so hold on. So for this article, they looked at 100,000 Strava uploads, and they found, perhaps unsurprisingly, that the Boston Marathon is significantly faster than the New York City Marathon. So this year, in 2023, about 53% of the runners that entered the Boston Marathon, so about 16,000 runners, they uploaded their run to Strava. Now, to me, the most fascinating thing is that only 53% of runners uploaded their run to Strava. Seriously, what are the other 47% doing with their run data? Are they just holding onto it and not sharing it? I think that's the most confusing data point in this whole article, so I'm glad to get it out the way up front. So we all know that we have to qualify for the Boston Marathon, and that BQ qualifying standard is a benchmark that about 10% of marathoners reach. So get this, 55% of runners in the Boston Marathon finished in 3 hours and 30 minutes or faster. Only 20% of runners at the New York City Marathon finish in 3 hours and 30 minutes or faster. At Boston, 73% of runners finish 4 hours or faster, compared to New York City, which has 43% of runners finishing in 4 hours or faster. And this is a big one. At 2023 Boston, 47% of runners re-BQ'd. They BQ'd at B, compared to just 7% of runners at New York City. So if you have run both marathons, I want to hear from you. Now, I've run the Boston Marathon 7 times. I've only run New York City once. And when I ran New York City, it wasn't to race it. It was just for fun. But in my experience, I think New York City is a harder course than Boston. What do you think? So the Boston Marathon is a notoriously hilly course, especially in the second half of the race. But the runners, quite obviously, are very experienced. And at the Boston Marathon, despite the very fast downhill in the beginning and the hilly end of the course, had 13% of the finishers run a negative split. And this is especially impressive when we compare it to London and Chicago, which are remarkably faster races than Boston. At London and Chicago, 11% of the field ran a negative split. And even in Berlin, the fastest marathon in the world with a net downhill, only 16% of the runners ran a negative split. Honestly, I would have thought the numbers would have been far different between Boston and Berlin. Okay, just a brief reminder that in this video, we are going to be talking about structuring our weekly running, like the types of runs and the structure of those runs that we put in each week. And by talking about the Boston Marathon and comparing it to other races, my point is just to show you what qualifiers of the Boston Marathon actually do, because it is different. Now, for the marathoners that run Boston, their median peak mileage is 53 miles a week with a training time of about 7 hours and 31 minutes. London has a median peak training week of 37 miles and 5 hours and 49 minutes. Training time, and New York City runners' median peak mileage is 39 miles and 6 hours and 19 minutes of training. Clearly, if you are going to run Boston, you have probably put in an effort to get there, more so than you might if you got into London or New York City. And of course, it is fairly obvious that faster runners get to Boston because of the qualifying standards that it takes to get there. But I think the main point that I wanted to convey to you is that runners that go to Boston, that qualify for the Boston Marathon, they do train substantially more than runners that go to other races. And across all the marathon majors, the runners that run Boston, they do train more, with an average of 8 hours and 10 minutes a week, and a median number of days per week of training of 5, so they're running 5 days a week. And that's across all finishers running under 3 hours and 30 minutes. Runners that finish between 3 hours and 30 minutes and 4 hours, their average number of runs drop to 4, and it just goes down from there. But there is definitely a correlation with how many miles we run and how much time we put in per week when we're looking at actually getting to the Boston Marathon. Now, the article also compares the Manchester Marathon with the Boston Marathon, and the Manchester Marathon happens the day before the Boston Marathon. Now, the Manchester Marathon is the second largest marathon in the UK, but on average, the runners that run Boston are running for 5.5 hours per week compared to 4 hours a week for the runners that run Manchester. And 56% of the runners that run Boston hit 50 miles in a week, compared to just 20% of the runners that run the Manchester Marathon. 80% of the Boston runners hit 40 miles a week compared to only 42% of the Manchester runners. Now, something that the article brought up is that Boston Marathon runners don't tend to make their long run longer than any other runners of any other world marathon major, but they do run more vert. The article points out that Boston runners that ran between 3 hours and 3 hours and 30 minutes had an average of 1,047 feet of gain per week. And that's compared with around 720 to 740 feet of elevation per week for Berlin, Tokyo, and Chicago. Okay, so what we've got from this article is that people that are running the Boston Marathon, they tend to run a lot more than people that are running other marathons. So perhaps if going to Boston is something that you have in the future, maybe this data will be beneficial to you. I don't know. I am certainly not recommending that you just go ahead and bump your mileage and the time running up and you will magically qualify for Boston. But clearly we have to take the numbers and the data with a pinch of salt. But it is fascinating, right? Okay, the next article that I want to talk about is one by Jason Fitzgerald, and the article is titled 2 Golden Rules When Setting Up Any Weekly Running Schedule. And Jason says that rule number 1 is to distribute your effort evenly. So we're not talking about weekend warriors where you just sit around all week and then you go out on the weekend and you crush all your goals and you go out and you log all your miles on the weekend. Gotta space it out, my friends. We're also typically not looking at doing back-to-back hard workouts. We want to separate them with an easy day or a rest day. Now, I don't know how many of you will actually do back-to-back really hard workouts, but I think what this article is getting at is kind of like they're looking at new runners, and you know how new runners will go out and for some reason new runners just don't like to run slow. They like to go out and they see these huge gains that they're getting from running fast, and they tend to run fast too often. Maybe not specific speed work, but just running too fast too much. But if we want to see these adaptations, if we want to get better, we need to allow our bodies to repair and to get stronger after we do our speed work. And the same thing goes with strength training. We're not going to crush our legs, do a major squat session day after day after day. We're going to separate those major squat sessions out over the week. Jason also points out that it's important to distribute the boring activities, and he identifies those as cross training, treadmill running, or strength training. For a lot of us runners, those are fairly boring, and you want to spread those out. You want to distribute those over your week, because otherwise you're going to get stale. It's no fun to be bored. And if you spread them out over your week and you intersperse some fun stuff like your speed work or like your long run with friends, your motivation is probably going to get a bump. And when our motivation gets a bump, we're more likely to enjoy everything else. Okay, the second rule that Jason says is most important, well, the second of the 2 golden rules, is to prioritize what's important. And this is also going to depend. It's never just easy. So it depends on what you're training for. Now, prioritizing what's important also depends on what your priorities are. Maybe your priorities are continuing to run, but also maintaining a solid family life. You want to be there for your family. You don't want to be gone every day. If that is what's most important to you and you can't work around it, then you're going to have to run on the downtime from being with your family. Now, Jason says that the long run is usually the most important run of the week. And this is because many of us lack aerobic capacity, and the long run is what builds that. The second most important thing to do in your week is these faster workouts. For me, I usually do intervals and I'll do a tempo on another day. But if you're training for shorter distances, like a 5K or less, these faster workouts, they become the most important run. The long run is not as important as the speed work when you're doing shorter distances. That makes sense, right? And Jason says the next most important training aspect is not your long run, but your medium long run. And the idea is to keep building endurance. And there are lots of other modifications that Jason talks about in the article, but of course I will link to it in the show notes and you can go ahead and read that for yourself. I think it's a pretty good read. I recommend you check it out. But guys, I want to hear from you. I want to know how you structure your workouts the week. I want to know what you're training for and if that has anything to do with how you structure your workouts. I mean, obviously it does. If you're 20 weeks out from a marathon, your structure is going to be a little different than if you're 6 weeks out from a marathon, right? But either way, I want to know about you. And I had a pretty good week of running. And if you're not following me on Strava, I highly encourage you to go over to Strava, give me a follow and check out what I did last week. I'm not going to go into it here. I think it's a bit boring. I mean, not boring for me. I love seeing everything I've done, but maybe boring for some of you. And because I said boring, why don't you put the yawning face emoji in the comments if you've made it to this point in the video. And with that, it's Matt B. Be kind, be happy, run well. I'll see you in a couple of days.